and welcome to a special On Location from the Franciscan University of Steubenville. I'm Doug Keck here, delighted to be with our author, Dr. Regis Martin, to talk about his book, Still Point. It's Lost Longing and Our Search for God. It's great to meet you after all these years.
No, I'm delighted.
I've been watching you on Franciscan University Presents. And
how distressing
back when it was Focus, years before that.
Right,
how many years have you actually been doing that
I
show?
think several centuries.
Centuries old?
But
well,
maybe,
certainly beginning in the last century, certainly, right.
Maybe about 20 years. We've done numberless shows.
Right, and you've been teaching here that whole time, right?
I think this is number 26.
And what do you actually teach here at the university?
I teach systematic theology. I'm not competent enough to teach biblical theology, and since we have Scott Hahn, he sort of displaces everyone.
But I don't understand. He says that Regis Martin is a sage for our time.
It cost a small fortune to get him to say
I wanted
that.
you to explain to me what a sage is. What is a sage?
I think it's, isn't it sort of a plant?
Yeah, like sagebrush? Yeah,
Yes, right. It's a real stretch. Scott was, I think, being somewhat hyperbolic, but I'm grateful to have the puff.
Right.
I hope it gets people to buy the book.
Now, most people, when I used to watch you in the show, I figured you were from Oxford or someplace.
Yeah.
But you're from Pittsburgh.
From Pittsburgh, right, yes, and have a fanatical devotion to the Steelers, who disappoint me nearly every season. But that's my hometown, and it's less than 40 minutes away.
And were you raised a Catholic?
I was, I'm a cradle Catholic.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about how many books have you actually written?
I think maybe about half a dozen, but they don't last long.
What do you mean they don't last long?
Well, somebody said your books are like yogurt. They have a very short shelf life.
Oh, okay.
So
because you're usually topical in what you're talking about?
people don't read them.
Oh, okay.
So you have your job cut out for you to try to raise consciousness about my stuff.
Well, you have a wonderful use of language.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah.
And Still Point, Lost Longing and Our Search for God. What is the still point?
Well, it's a line from T.S. Eliot. It's an image that is
you have that listed right
central
at the beginning of the book,
to the four quartets. You could say that this is where Christ shows up at the still point of the turning world. It's a point of intersection where the infinite God meets the finite man, where nature and grace connect, a point of convergence.
Now, you've also got Elie Wiesel's line, "Where is God now?" as a setup for later in the book.
Right.
Also, the very existence of the question implies the existence of an answer.
Yes.
And that's is that the founder from?
That's, Luigi Giussani.
Communion of Liberation, is that?
Right.
He's involved. And then you also have something from Virgil in the Aeneid.
Yeah.
How did he jump into that?
Well, it's illustrative, I think, of the issue that I grapple with in the book. Who planted this fire in the belly, this longing for God? Virgil.
Which you think there is?
It is. It's constitutive of what it means to be human, and later on it becomes indispensable to becoming fully alive.
Is that desperate desire? Is that what you mean by desperate desire?
Right. That had been the working title of the book, and then a quick Google revealed the unwitting folly of that choice.
That it had been used before?
Well, all the wrong
for all the wrong
associations.
reasons. Okay, right, I can understand. The other desperate desire.
It's not a sexualized account of desire.
It went off like a firecracker, and you kept hearing that phrase.
Right, I did, yes. And it arose out of an experience I had as a child.
Right, you talk about here.
I was lost. Only for a few minutes. I was quickly recovered, but the point about being lost is you never think you will be recovered.
Right.
At least in the case of the child, and when it comes to being lost, we're all children.
And that's where the panic sets in.
Panic, yes, paralysis.
Right.
That's a kind of hellish privation, a predicament of being lost seemingly forever.
Well, what's interesting, when I was reading that, I was thinking back to when I was a kid, and I went to the World's Fair in New York. At the Vatican Pavilion, of all places, I got lost.
Is that right?
Yes, and I remember that, reading that brought all those emotions back of where suddenly your family's gone, and you're in this awash of people, and you just can't believe they're not there and you can't find them.
Right, yeah. One episode which I didn't use, but it just came to mind a moment ago, Martin of Tours finds himself lost in the mountains, and he's suddenly overtaken by thugs who want to kill him. And he says, I don't worry about myself, I worry about you, because I'm not lost. Jesus is with me all the time. His love encompasses, surrounds me. It's you I worry about, because by treating me unjustly, you may forfeit your right to mercy. I mean, that kind of serenity. I mean,
I guess he lived to tell the tale.
Right, he did. Yeah, I mean, I don't have that serenity, but that's the aim. Right. That we never quite arrive at.
You say, what if there really were a loneliness so final that nothing in this world could remedy the pain of it, a circumstance of abandonment so definitive that neither word nor gesture could deliver us from it?
Yeah. I mean, that's heavy, I think. It's not just the fear of death, but it's the fear of extinction, the fear of being lost forever. That being lost in that park or at the pavilion is really only a prelude to an everlasting lostness.
Well, you talk about that because later in the book you talk about the idea of, in a sense, the eternity of being lost in one way versus being extinguished.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, annihilation, right. I think, is not so bad because you have no consciousness.
Which is like I think a Jehovah's Witness teaching, in fact.
Right, but to be alive and yet lost at the same time, and know that there are people who might wish to rescue you, but they don't know where you are, or they're indifferent to you. I mean, that, I think, is a terrifying prospect. If God, in the end, doesn't give a fig about the creature, I think that induces a kind of hopelessness, a despair.
And that's what you see in society today, I would think, right? Isn't that what we have?
It's domesticated, but it disguised. But I do think that when you peel away all the distractions, that, I think, is that's the demon that besets most men.
Well, you say death, you see, is never far away and no one gets out alive.
Yes. Yeah.
But don't we see today in some cases with the youth movement, everybody wants to stay young, right, and everybody's trying to figure out how to look like they're 60 or 40 when they're 70 or 80. It's almost this idea of trying to figure out how to live eternally without having to deal with God.
Right, yeah, without having to go through the dark night at all. It would be hilarious if it weren't so pathetic. But you're right, a whole generation seems to be sunk in that fantasy, and they need to be disabused of it. I mean, death, at least the saints tell us, is a friend. In the end, it's not extinction, it's Jesus crossing that threshold and taking us by the hand, and we are welcomed into the arms of God. And that, I think, is a tantalizing prospect. So, death, thou shalt die.
Well, also with the idea that because of the sense, I think this loss of the sense of the eternal, that people don't have that anymore.
Right, yeah.
It does make people pour into this life everything there is.
Yeah. It's not just a loss of the sense of it, but a loss of the relish for it, the savor. We're just not interested in heaven. I mean, what does heaven offer that I can't find on planet Earth because I've got a credit card?
Or something, right?
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Or I can create a virtual heaven, and that's going to be fine. Yeah, a drug-induced ecstasis.
Well, you say the maintenance of our human dignity, you could say, the very life of the soul depends on holding fast to the still point.
Yeah. I mean, that's the Christic point. That's where God shows up, where he appears, where he connects with us. And it's a kind of collision, and we're bumping into him all the time. And so we need to cultivate a sense of awareness of the other.
You say we go to the Father of our souls, but it's necessary to pass by the dragon. Who's the dragon, and why do we have to pass by?
Oh, that's a passage, I think, from Cyril
right.
of Jerusalem, part of a catechetical instruction. The dragon is the devil, who symbolizes death, and he's there waiting for us, lurking, hiding behind the bush. And you can't get to heaven without first confronting him. Grace is what enables us.
Whether we like it or not.
Right. I mean, we navigate our way through or bypassing the jaws of death with grace.
And you talk about the innate we have for God, and you argue in the book the very existence of this desire, when pushed especially to the point of desperation, provides real testimony, albeit oblique and paradoxical, to that adamantine quality of hope on which finally our conquest of death does depend. Could you break that down? And what does that mean in simple terms?
Yeah, that sounds a little pompous. It means that we are born with a desire, a longing that nothing in this world can assuage. Only God can satisfy this deep, desperate desire for optimal happiness. It's adamantine in that sense. It can't be shattered or broken up, and we're not going to be fulfilled apart from him. We were made by him, for him, and unless we have him in this everlasting communion, we're going to be unhappy, stuck in a kind of infernal isolation.
Well, you kind of do a setup, and then you go into chapter 1, and it gets very personal. You talk about, you open up about when my mother died following a sudden massive heart attack, September '95. Entirely unexpected, the news was received with incomprehension. And then you also talk about, in hindsight, I now see that my brother's, Kevin's death 2 years before AIDS may well have hastened her own end. So what made you decide to make this a personal book?
Well, I think trying to come to terms with 3 very significant people in my life who suddenly, over time, gave up the ghost. My brother Kevin, then my mother, and finally my father. I mean,
Who you dedicate the book to?
Yeah, the sort of vacancy that suddenly appears in one's life, and you have to cope with the absence, the silence. Particularly my brother Kevin, because he and I had a somewhat conflicted relation, stormy at best. And
Based
I
on
needed
his lifestyle and things,
right.
choices he
Yeah,
made.
I mean, we disagreed about everything, and then we agreed not to disagree and just to keep quiet about the abyss that separated our 2 worldviews. But then he died, and I had to try and come to terms with his passing.
Well, you talk about a little bit right after that about kind of the whole thing about the Holocaust and where was God, and did God not care about the 6 million? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? So you go to that with our Lord. So one would say, gee, he wasn't even helping his own son out. Why should he help the rest of us?
Right. I mean, John Paul has a wonderful line in Crossing the Threshold of Hope about that if it weren't for the crucifixion, then the truth that God is love would remain unfounded.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
that to me is a gesture of profound solidarity.
It's on the bottom of page 5, in fact.
Yeah. Where is God now? There he is. He's there in the death camps of the Third Reich. He identifies with the least and the lost. And that, I think, inspires a great deal of consolation. There's hope. You know, God has become one of us, and he feels our pain, and he can render that pain redemptive.
Now you talk about the idea that we cannot free ourselves from our alienization from God. Actually, it's a quote here, I guess.
From Balthazar.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you go on to say, but does anyone really believe this anymore?
Yeah.
How credible is the Christian claim for those who live thoroughly secularized lives? And that is the problem, right?
It is. I think, I mean, for most people, they are master of their destiny, captain of their ship. They shape the future, sort of a Promethean myth that whatever I achieve, it's my doing. And so I've got to take credit for it. But in fact, you can't achieve the happiness that you were created for without grace, without God. Somebody has to step into the picture and complete it.
Isn't one of the things that's actually in our society that brings this, in a sense, this despair out there, is because people get the things they would think that would make them happy early on in their life, and they realize they don't make them happy.
Yeah, they're not happy.
At least in the past lives, people would think in many ways about these kind of dreams of the future. They would never really get there.
Right. It's the whole irony of the human condition that we pursue ardently the very goods that we know will not complete us. I guess, you know, the wisdom that we acquire is pretty much secured through anguish, you know, suffering. It teaches us that we're dependent upon the awful mercy of God.
Right, but why call the physician if you think yourself perfectly fit? C.S. Lewis writes in the essay God in the Dock that first appeared in 48, the great barrier I have met is the almost total absence from the minds of my audience of any sense of sin. Wow, that, I can't, in 1948?
1948, I know.
You know, because it seems to be, in a lot of ways, most of it would think that's something post-60s.
Yeah, and you would also think that in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic world war, that people would wake up and smell the coffee, you know. We created this mess, this bloody chaos, and only a God can save us. Who do we think we are?
Why did you decide to mention Joan Didion in her book, The Year of Magical Thinking? A lot of people might have heard that. It was a popular section.
It was fashionable, and she represents a mindset, a literary mood, which I think is dominant among people who read and think and write, the tastemakers, and she had been a kind of Catholic, and so too her husband, well, Anglican, and they repudiated everything, and yet they didn't seem to miss what they had lost. And when her husband dies, she quickly squares her atheism with his annihilation. And I have a problem with that. It seems to me that she's going against the grain of her own humanity. That when you love someone, what you really are saying to that person is, you're going to live forever. I cannot resign myself to never seeing you again. I mean, that's human.
Right, as opposed to just becoming a photograph on the table.
That's right. And I mean, that to me is just utterly incredible. Yeah.
Real terror is how you kind of related to the whole thing, thinking about that.
Yeah.
And thinking again that you would never see. And that's a thing too. I mean, the consolation we have when we lose a loved one is the understanding we have that we will see them again.
Right. Yeah, you know, when you see a loved one stretched out on that gurney, that steel slab, and you ask yourself, am I ever going to run into this person again? If the answer were no, it seems to me you could not go on living. Life would be unendurable. It would be a horrible cheat. And then if there were a God, then he must be malevolent. He creates people for the sake of consigning them to oblivion. What kind of a God would do that?
Right.
Not a lover.
In chapter 3, you talk about Orpheus, and the desperate man ventures bravely into the pit of hell in search of the woman he loves. And talk about Virgil and Ovid. And it's interesting with that, because in reading that particular piece, I remember reading it and thinking how much it seems similar to what Dante wrote.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. I mean, it's a myth, of course, but it resonates with the ordinary, universal human experience. I mean, here's this guy, Orpheus, who falls in love with Eurydice, and on the day of their marriage, I think she's bitten by a serpent, and she's dead. And this is the world before Christ came to redeem it. So she falls into hell. And what does Orpheus do? He approaches Pluto, the god of the underworld, and plays his music, and it melts the heart of Pluto. And he says, okay, you can go in and fetch your wife and take her out, but you can't look back. And what does he do? He looks back, and she sinks forever into Hades.
Why does he look back?
I think to make sure that she's still with
there,
him.
right?
Right, that she's not just a figment of his imagination.
Well, you say each of us is a kind of Orpheus, I like to think, who will not suffer those we love to go down into the pit unaccompanied by those who love them.
Yeah. I mean, that I think testifies to that mysterious article of the Creed. He descended into hell. I mean, Jesus goes in desperate search of the lost.
Real hope, then, is neither cheap grace nor facile optimism. Instead, as the Church itself insists, it is a determination of will wholly to anchor our lives in God.
Yeah, it's rooted in a person. It's not just a principle. But the trick about hope is the outcome doesn't depend on us. It depends on God. I mean, I may hope that I'll succeed in a class, and if I study, then by George I will. But real hope depends on another who may or may not wish to confer that olive branch.
You also talk about nihilism going mainstream, and you also mention Seinfeld, so you do watch TV.
From time to time, just to see what the enemy is up to. And he didn't put together all those shows about nothing.
Nothing, that's what at least that was the theory behind it, right?
So it's gone mainstream.
You say, or as the deconstructionists might say, how wonderful it is to do away with truth, because then one is spared the hard work of trying to be right. I thought this was great. Leaving only the necessity of trying to be funny.
Yeah, and Seinfeld is undeniably funny. Right. Yeah. But I mean, you couldn't construct a life around those characters.
Right, exactly. Another thing struck me in chapter 4, you go, suppose it were only possible for human beings to imagine, as John Lennon famously invited us to do, a world without heaven, without God, etc. And you kind of have the lines from the song Imagine, which I remember, that was the theme of our junior show in high school, in the Catholic high school. Yeah, I mean, you'd sing, you look at the lyrics now and you say, what were we singing about? But it was just kind of this generic peace, love, and let's all get along kind of idea, right?
Yes. It was, I mean, an invitation to despair. Yeah, I mean, who wants to imagine that? An empty universe at the end of the day.
Now, some of us years ago used to learn how to, construct sentences. We have to do that as kids growing up and stuff.
So
diagramming sentences. Right. So I got to ask you, we've entered the world of the subjunctive.
Yeah.
An almost unreal place where we're likely to find the subtle glutton whom Emily Dickinson designates as hope. What do you mean we've entered into the world of the subjunctive?
The subjunctive is what somebody called a mood of mystery. And hope is really subjunctive. I don't know, I'm going to be in heaven, but I hope, I have this confident expectation that he who promised me paradise will not betray me at the last. But I don't know. I'm not a Protestant. I don't have knowledge of the next life, but I do have hope. It's subjunctive. It's conditional. It depends on another. So I venture myself in hope.
But you also talk about the exercise of the audacity of hope. There was another book written by somebody else with that title actually in it.
I stole his line.
But you also talk, I never thought about, you talk about the disconsolate Martha, sister to poor Lazarus, and the whole idea. I always think of, he's raised from the dead. Jesus does come and raise him. But at the end of the day, he's going to die again.
Right, I know, yeah. Yet Gerald Van, a wonderful Dominican preacher, said that when Lazarus came back from the dead, he was sort of absent-minded, and it was difficult to get him to pass the pepper or the mustard. Who knows what he had seen, because he doesn't tell us.
Right.
He's in a kind of stupor. And you're right, he has to await the second death.
Anyway.
But I think he's fortified by hope.
Now, you go right from there to quoting Nietzsche, all joy wills eternity. That sounds pretty good. But then people, I got to remember, he's also the one with God is
The
dead.
crazy man.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, who ended up insane.
I mean, it's sort of like a broken clock. At least twice a day it's going to be right. I mean, Nietzsche now and again stumbles onto genuine insight.
Well, that's what happens sometimes with these philosophers. Sometimes they have one particular phrase that actually makes sense.
Right.
You read the rest of their drivel and you realize how
Yeah.
off base it
But certainly there's something prophetic about him, because as a practical matter, people live as if the village atheist were right. God is dead. He's no longer here. We don't need him. We don't turn to him.
Now, you also talk about in chapter 6 the idea of life as a search.
Yeah.
So life is to be understood as search, as quest, an exploration in constant search of the truth about ourselves and about the world in which we find ourselves. And this is in the section kind of on communion liberation.
Oh, yeah, when little Luigi is lost in the forest of Tradate outside Milan, and I think for a full 2 hours he screams, as only an Italian can. Right. And that presupposes that life is search. Why does he cry out? He must somehow intuit that there's somebody who could answer him, someone that he might summon by his screams, who was just poised to enter that forest and rescue this little boy.
Right.
And
so there
that's,
must be someone to hear those.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant by that epigraph at the beginning.
Right.
That the existence of the question presupposes
Right.
an answer.
Now, this is another question. When one is isolated or alone, you would not recommend developing a relationship with a volleyball, apparently.
Oh,
right?
yeah, I think that's a reference
That's
to
where the
that
Tom Hanks movie,
very
right?
silly
Castaway,
movie,
right?
Castaway. Maybe he has an affair with a coconut or something.
No, I don't think he goes that far.
All right.
But he does have an affair with a particular, he doesn't have an
Right.
affair, he does have a relationship.
Some
with
kind
a-
of relationship, yeah. Right,
you
yeah.
know, he, in fact, so much so that he actually goes after him.
Right,
He's built
right.
such a relationship.
Yeah.
It just goes to show, I guess, the human need
Yeah, it
for
does, yeah.
companionship.
Right. I mean, maybe Tom Hanks can pull it off, but for the rest of us, we need a real human being.
Right, because you even talk about a little bit about Julian in Norwich. You quote her and you say, the castaway you see is every person.
Right, yeah. Every man, I know. I mean, Julian of Norwich is a wonderful source, I think. I mean, God, Jesus speaks to her in these 13 or 14 showings, these divine revelations, and he tells her, all shall be well and all manner of thing shall be well. I mean, where does God get off making a promise like that? That he will make good all that is defective. And that, I think, is the deepest meaning of Christ's descent into, the shame and the sorrow and the horror of hell. He
Right.
redeemed everything.
Right. At the end of chapter 6 is a passage I'd like you to read. So why don't you get set up for that? And I say, Christianity then is really nothing other than an event that each of us is meant to encounter. And then you say, here's a lovely passage from St. Augustine that sums up incomparably all that I have been trying to say. Would you like
Sure,
to read
no,
it?
I'd be happy to. You were walking in your own way, a vagabond, straying through wooded places, through rugged places, torn in all your limbs. You were seeking a home, and you did not find it. There came to you the way itself, and you were set therein. Walk by him, the man, and you come to God. This, is very striking because there is the expectation that we will somehow find a way out. We'll be rescued. But when the rescue comes, the form it assumes infinitely exceeds what we had expected. Christ himself, God, disguised as a human being, enters into that forest, that dark wood, to rescue us. I mean, that's what happens to Dante in the first canto of the Inferno. I mean, God answers his cry, his prayer, and dispatches Beatrice and then Virgil to help guide him through this dark wood.
Now, you clearly wrote this book for yourself in some ways, but you obviously wrote it for other people. What do you think someone can get out of this?
I wrote it for money. I was hoping that I could, corner the market.
Honest, at least, right?
I haven't made any money, but I mean, what really prompted me to write it was the editor at Ave Maria, who said, "Look, we'd like you to write a book." And so I said, fine. And then my wife left for a month to help our daughter, who had just given birth to their second child, and suddenly this window of opportunity opens, and I decide I've got a month.
Right.
I've got to do something.
And that's where you had that phrase put in your heart, right?
Right. Yeah, that's where it all began.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, it's going to end for us right now.
Well,
it's been great.
Thank you very much,
talk to
Doug.
you,
This
Regis.
has
After
been
all these years,
a joy.
You've been a great teacher to many of us.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
EWTN has helped in a little way to promulgate
Well, you have
some of your
helped.
thought.
You have helped an endless number of human beings.
Very good.
God bless you.
Speaking here with Dr. Regis Martin, author of Still Point, Lost Longing, and Our Search for God, and it's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. We're on location at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. We thank them and we thank you for joining us. See you next time.